Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the terrifying Vaughn Manor, where we are getting into the Halloween spirit a bit early, because I'll be doing my 10 favorite horror books. Yes, it's another ridiculous top 10 list. Last week I did my 10 favorite science fiction books. I'll link it down below because you don't want to miss any of my fantastic videos. But this week, it's horror. And so these are my 10 favorite horror books. I am not claiming that these are the greatest horror books, though some of the greatest horror books are on this list. These are my favorites. These are the horror books that I really, really like. So we're going to go 10 to 1, as we do in this sort of list. So, number 10, The Fisherman by John Langham. The Fisherman. Now, this is a really, really dark and epic novel of horror. It's epic and yet it's kind of intimate at the same time. John Langham really accomplishes quite a bit with this novel. It is a story of two men who have both lost their wives, and they find comfort by going fishing together. So they develop a friendship by just going fishing. And one day, they decide to fish in the wrong place. Oh boy, do they. Now, this book, it's interesting the way this book is structured. It basically has a surrounding story that involves these two men. It has a story inside that story, which is a story which is told to them, which is basically a novelette within a novel. And actually, the only bad thing I could say about this whole book is that in real life, it would take a lot longer to tell this story that they are told than it seemed to take. John Langham, I think, realized that, and he came up with kind of an excuse for it, but I'm not sure it really works. And I didn't care anyway, because of the rest of the book was so darn fantastic and scary and terrifying and bewildering and just horrifying. And it has some of the greatest imagery I can remember reading in quite a while. It's sort of a dark horror fantasy story. You can really see the influence of H.P. Lovecraft, but it's told in an entirely different way. It's an entirely different thing. But it does have that kind of dark cosmic horror behind the other horrors that are going on in this story. So The Fisherman, this is a fantastic book. If you like horror, you've really got to read this one. So that was The Fisherman. Number 9 is going to be A Head Full of Ghosts. A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. Now this one, well, Paul Tremblay, he writes some creepy books. Not all of them are, I guess, fantastic. They're all good at least. This one is his best book. This was his first major horror novel, I believe. And it's a kind of, well, it's kind of possession story where you have a young girl who might or might not be possessed by demons. She's either possessed by demons or it's even worse than that. It's a really haunting, really tragic, a really sad, and a very frightening story. Stephen King left his obligatory blurb on this one, of course. Basically, he sent out a tweet saying, "This book scared the hell out of me, and I'm not an easy guy to scare." That's high praise from Stephen King. That's a better blurb than he usually gives. And it's true. This is a scary book, A Head Full of Ghosts. At least I found it to be scary. And I really liked it. I still think it's Tremblay's best, although most of his books have something to recommend them. So that is A Head Full of Ghosts. So now we're coming up to number 8. What could it be? Number 8 is The Elementals by Michael McDowell. The Elementals. Now, I read this years ago, The Elementals by Michael McDowell, who is probably, he's starting to get his fame back as a writer. People are starting to remember this guy. He wrote a lot of paperback originals back in the day, and he was great at it. Great Southern Gothic horror novelist. Southern Gothic horror, that was this guy's thing. And he was sort of forgotten for a while because all his stuff there were paperback originals. And for the longest time, most people remembered him for being a screenwriter for Beetlejuice. That was his claim to fame. But it's his novels that he really should be remembered for, and The Elementals was a really good one. I've never been able to get that story out of my mind since I've read it. And that's why it has made its way onto this list, because he managed to give this novel such a fantastic sense of place. The way he describes the place in this book where these horrifying events take place, it seems real. It feels like when you think back on the novel, like you've been there, like you visited this place and kind of knew some of these people that were in this book. It was a heck of a book. Sadly, we lost Michael McDowell to AIDS-related illness. He was pretty great, and more people should remember this guy, and more people should read his books. This one, The Elementals, is a haunting, terrifying story with some great characters. It's excellent. You should definitely check out The Elementals, which brings us to number 7, Dark Gods by T.E.D. Klein. Now, this is the one book out of all these books which you might have a hard time. You might have a hard time finding this book. There were a few different editions of this. T.E.D. Klein didn't write much. In horror, he wrote, as far as I'm aware, 5 stories and 1 novel. And that 1 novel was based on one of those stories. And they were fantastic. Every single one of them. I think the novel is probably the weakest thing he wrote. It was good, but it was probably the weakest thing he wrote. The short story that he based the novel on, Events at the Proth Farm, I believe it was called, that short story was a lot better than the novel. It was a fantastic and terrifying short story. And this book, Dark Gods, it's a collection of 4 stories. And they're very, very frightening. You have 2 exceptional stories and 2 others that are really good. So this is one of those books that if you're ever in a used bookstore and you see this, pick it up, man. Don't even think about it. Pick it up. I don't care if it costs $20. That's cheap for this. Pick it up. I've seen this book go for like $90 paperback. I've seen it go for $100. I've seen ridiculous prices for this book. Because this author, I mean, it's a weird thing, this guy, that he wrote just this tiny amount of horror fiction, but it was some of the best horror fiction you'll ever read. And so, yeah, this guy's stories, if you can ever find if any of his stuff ever gets reprinted, which would be fantastic, this book should be reprinted. Definitely read it. Any chance you have to read this guy's stuff, do it. T.E.D. Klein, he wrote some good stuff. And a couple of the stories in here, Lovecraft inspired. Again, he did his own thing with them. They're 2 of the best Lovecraft inspired stories I've ever read. So, Dark Gods, man. If you can get it, and it might be tough to get, but if you can, get it. Which brings me to number 6. This is not so hard to get. This is The Great God Pan and Other Horror Stories by Arthur Machen. I like this edition because it has the 3 Impostors novel. It has The Great God Pan. It basically has all of Arthur Machen's best stuff. Doesn't have everything, but it has a lot of his best stuff. All the stories that you really want to read, if you've heard about this guy, it's in this book. And it's a really nice book from Oxford. Arthur Machen, of course, is a legendary writer of horror. He inspired H.P. Lovecraft. He inspired Robert E. Howard for some of his fiction. He wrote some terrifying, bewildering, frightening things, Arthur Machen. I've talked about him before a little bit on a Sunday Penguin that I did. I probably should talk about him some more. I probably should just read The 3 Impostors again and give a review of it. But fantastic writer, Arthur Machen. I kind of think that if you're into horror fiction, you've got to read this guy. You've got to, because he's influenced everybody. The Great God Pan is still one of the greatest horror stories ever written. So yeah, there you go. That brings us to, was that number 6? That was number 6. This brings us to number 5. Counting is hard, guys. It's hard. Number 5. I hope I didn't get the counting wrong. Did I get everything? Yes, I did. Man, it's tough counting. Number 5. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This book, again, it's a book that's influenced everything. It's a book that if you're into horror, you have to read. You've probably already read this book. And you probably already read it and you go, yeah, this is pretty fantastic. A dark, bleak, horrifying story of vampires who have taken over the world. And about the fella who was the unfortunate last man on Earth. And it's just a book about that. And it's incredibly well done. It's a science fiction story, which is also a horror story. One of the most terrifying horror science fiction stories you'll ever read is this one. It has just some incredible moments. I can't look at my watch without thinking of the moment when his watch stopped. And if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. They've made some movies about this book which aren't nearly as good. You might remember the Will Smith movie. It wasn't nearly as good. Forget that movie, read this book. If you haven't read this book, read this book. This book is incredible. So yeah, that's I Am Legend, which brings me to number 4. Number 4, which is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Pet Sematary, I think, in my opinion, this might change because I'm reading every book by Stephen King, but of all the Stephen King books I've read, this one works the best. I think Pet Sematary succeeds on every level as a horror novel. I think it might be the greatest horror novel ever written. It might not make the top of this list. It probably should, but it might not. But it probably is. Just as far as how it's constructed, everything works in this book. Everything that Stephen King does well, he does great in this book. This book is genuinely scary. This could be the scariest thing Stephen King has ever written or ever will write. I know there are some people that don't feel this way. I don't know how, but there are some people that feel differently, but I found this book terrifying. He even makes a cat scary, and you can't make cats scary. So, Pet Sematary, man. Like I said, this is one of those books a lot of you, if not all of you, have read. But again, if you haven't read it, read it. It's that good. Which brings us to number 3, Frankenstein. Specifically, the 1818 text of Frankenstein, if you can get it. Although, either version of Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Do I really need to say why? This book is fantastic. It's amazing. It's one of my favorite books of all time, Frankenstein. It works incredibly well as a horror story. It's quite a frightening horror story. Terrible things happen in this book. The Frankenstein's monster can be terrifying, but he can also be a character that you can sympathize with. I did a whole video on this for my Daily Penguin a few weeks ago. I love this book, Frankenstein. Again, if you haven't read it, read it. It's not that long of a book. It's actually a pretty short book. And it's fantastic. It reads really well today. It doesn't seem that dated. Some of the language does, but it's a really easy read. I urge you to read Frankenstein. Totally different from all those Frankenstein movies you might have seen. So yeah, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which brings us to number 2. And number 2 is going to be this guy, H.P. Lovecraft. How could it not? Now I'm choosing the Library of America Tales as the H.P. Lovecraft I'm going to throw up here, because as a single volume, this is probably the best single volume H.P. Lovecraft you could find. It has everything good that he does in this book. I think only The Hound is missing as far as really good stories. Everything else in this book is excellent. And you can read it from front to back and you'll get the Lovecraft experience. You won't miss out on anything important. You will know H.P. Lovecraft if you read this book. And has all the Cthulhu mythos in there. It has so much great stuff in this volume. Has this pulpy horror stuff like the Lurking Fear and Reanimator. It has all the Cthulhu stuff. It's just great. Just fantastic book. Do yourself a favor. Pick up this book if you haven't got it. Or if you want to get a complete H.P. Lovecraft, you can. Though as just a book about his horror stuff, you can't beat this one, really. So yeah, number 2, H.P. Lovecraft, which brings us to number 1. Oh, what could it be? What could it be? I know this is going to be a shock, guys. You're never going to see this one coming. Dracula. Of course it's Dracula. How could it not be Dracula? Dracula is the greatest horror novel ever, in my opinion. I love it. Now, I have a soft spot for Dracula for a lot of reasons. Not just because it's a fantastic story, not just because it's terrifying, but because it was the first novel I ever read. It was the first grown-up novel I've ever read. I read children's books, and then I read this. I was very young when I read this. I didn't understand most of what I was reading, but I loved it. And I will always remember that scene where the vampire women are crawling up to Jonathan Harker to suck his blood. I didn't get the whole sexual aspect of the whole thing because I was a little kid, but boy was it creepy. It was a frightening scene. The whole thing was scary. And Dracula himself, what a creepy guy. So much creepier and scarier than so many of the film versions. Magnificent, terrifying book. So much great stuff in Dracula. From the way it was written, the pacing is really good for most of Dracula. Has that brilliant opening section with Jonathan Harker visiting Dracula in Transylvania. And it also has a fantastic ending. Has kind of a chase ending at the end. You have the fearless vampire hunters which get together to battle Dracula. You have Van Helsing in this book talking all silly with his ridiculous accent. If there's any flaw in this book, I mean, it is a really melodramatic book. This is true. Really, a lot of melodrama here, but I don't mind that. I have a really high tolerance for melodrama. But if there is a flaw, it's probably just that there's too much Van Helsing in this Dracula book and not enough Dracula. That's the one thing I would change, I guess. But really, it all works really, really well, which is why it's inspired 9 gazillion movies and has never been out of print. Real easy to get your hands on this, and you should read it. I know there are still people out there who claim to love horror who haven't read Dracula, which is bewildering to me. I don't understand that. Are you just saving it for like when you're 80 or something? What? Just read it, you know. Just drop everything and read it. There's certain books you've just got to read if you're into horror, and Dracula's one of those books. So yeah, that's my 10 favorite horror books. I hope you enjoyed it. Catch me next week when I have some other top 10 list, which I don't know what it's going to be yet. But I will have another top 10 list up next week. And this is a good time, my little silly top 10 lists. And yeah, so I will catch you next time here at the terrifying stately Vaughan Manor when I do my Sunday Penguin. Okay, guys, you guys have a great day.